Welcome to the Gus Alva Perspective, a videocast that is directed at embracing gratitude and abundance over the mindset of scarcity and fear. I'm a board certified psychiatrist, and for me, it's a genuine pleasure being able to help out with these videocasts that are slated for inspiration as well as advice from a medical perspective. But the topic that I'd like to touch on today is a really interesting, complex one as it relates to medicine. The topic is the power of pressing the flesh. This is an interesting concept because we really need to understand the significance of physical contact in human interaction, particularly at the present time in the specific span of time that we live in right now. Human beings, for the most part, are inherently social creatures. We're reliant on meaningful connections as well as interactions for personal well being and societal cohesion. And while communication has evolved through various mediums at the present time, we rely heavily on different forums from a social media perspective to communicate. It's critical to know that there remains a fundamental aspect that transcends language as well as technology, which I just described, the power of pressing the flesh. Physical contact, believe it or not, comes in many different forms. It can be a handshake, it can be a hug, it can be an embrace, but any one of these carries immense significance in human interactions. From a cultural perspective, it's one thing to travel to a different country and be met or greeted with a kiss on the cheek. That is not an uncommon thing, but if we don't necessarily know that that is one of the social norms, we might be quite taken aback by that. And what I'd like to touch on right now are three specific areas where pressing the flesh is very relevant. First, we're going to talk about the physiological correlates associated with pressing the flesh. Then we'll talk about the psychological well-being that comes from it. And lastly, the social implications. Since we are touching on three different areas, I thought it might be a good idea to actually touch on three salient points from each one of those particular areas. So let's start first with what happens with our physiology, what happens to us physically when there is physical contact. The very first thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are neurochemical reactions when we touch. With physical contact, the brain releases oxytocin, which is oftentimes referred to as a love hormone. Oxytocin promotes bonding, trust, empathy, and fosters a sense of connection and reduces stress levels. I can think back on my own history and, being able to hold my children when they were babes in the middle of the night, being able to actually give them milk that had been pumped so that I could actually help out with nighttime feedings and feeling that sense of trust and love that was actually going back and forth from my children, back and forth to me. A wonderful experience. Let's take a look at a second point. That is the regulation of stress responses. Physical touch has been found to lower cortisol levels, and ultimately, the stress hormone cortisol is a hormone that's associated with a lot of detrimental issues. When stress is allowed to run free, it creates great problems in our bodies and our brains. Beneficial effects, however, are noted with physical contact on overall health, well being, and the immune function of the individual through a lowering of cortisol levels. And the third point is that of pain perception as well as healing. And there's much to be said about that physician's touch because it turns out that touch has a remarkable ability to alleviate pain and to promote healing. A gentle touch will activate specialized receptors in the skin, which trigger the release of endorphins, natural opiates, which help us feel better. They're natural painkillers that promote relaxation and well being. So, ultimately, as you note, the overall physiological benefit of that, you know, pressing the flesh can be such a very important component. Now let's talk about the psychology of it. It turns out that when we press the flesh, there's an emotional communication that gets conveyed. Physical contact serves as a powerful reminder or a powerful mean of nonverbal communication. It conveys emotions that sometimes words are unable to capture. A warm embrace, a reassuring hand on the shoulder, a comforting touch can convey not only empathy, but also affection far more deeply than verbal expressions. And a second very important point is that of trust and bonding. Touch plays this crucial role in establishing and strengthening interpersonal relationships. Touch builds trust, fosters emotional intimacy, and deepens the bonds between individuals. This leads to a more satisfying and fulfilling connection among individuals. And ultimately, one of the topics that I'm particularly prone to look at is mental well being. Enhanced mental health, including having a reduced symptomatology of anxiety, depression, or loneliness, are brought about by that human touch. Promoting emotional resilience and psychological healing are some of the components that we oftentimes don't think of, but are inherently there when we press the flesh. And the last point that I'd like to touch on is what happens with us socially, the social dynamic and the social fabric that we operate under. So the three themes that I'd like to look at here include the cultural and symbolic significance. Much as I started, this is something that varies across different societies and contexts. For the most part, when we greet someone, we typically shake hands or we give them a hug, or there's some other form of touch which symbolizes not just a greeting, but also a conveyance of respect, an utterance without having to say it, a friendship or celebration. This serves as a cultural norm, and it's an expression of social connection that is uniquely suited to different geographies or different cultural contexts as we walk through them. I guarantee you that if you greet friends in Spain, it's going to be significantly different than if you do so in the States, as it would be in France versus Germany. So, a very important point for us to take into consideration. The next thing is the sense of group cohesiveness and cooperation. Touch, believe it or not, fosters a sense of belonging. It strengthens social bonds within groups and communities, and it can unite individuals by promoting cooperation and enhancing teamwork. This ultimately leads towards a collective sense of well being and synergy, which are some of the catalysts that we're always looking for. And the last point here from that social issue is a bridge for inclusion as well as empathy. And particularly in the society that we live in right now, touch transcends social barriers. So long as it's done respectfully, it fosters inclusivity and empathy. Individuals can overcome differences and express solidarity by creating bridges of understanding that promote not just that social cohesiveness, but also harmony. So as I've walked you through, again, three different facets with three different subsets of things that we might be able to take into consideration, I would certainly, espouse the thought that in a world that is increasingly digitally connected, the power of pressing the flesh remains one of the essential elements of human interaction. Physical touch ultimately influences, as we made mention, our physiology, our psychology, and our social dynamics. So, by offering a profound means of connection, communication, and well being, we can readily recognize the value and the significance of what pressing the flesh is all about. Interestingly enough, when I first started out in my medical subspecialty, one of the things that my mentors would espouse was, well, the one thing you don't want to do is lay hands on a patient if you are practicing psychiatry. Well, certainly that has evolved greatly. And obviously, there have to be boundaries that are set up from a professional point of view, but ultimately, giving that reassuring touch to someone that is in need of empathy and additional support can be so powerful and particularly help us connect in a better manner. I thank you all for joining us on this segment of the Gus Alva Perspective videocast and earmarked at enhancing our ability to wrap our hands around gratitude and abundance. Thank you so much for joining us.